You've been told that raising your vibration is about meditating more, thinking positive thoughts, and surrounding yourself with crystals and sage. But Carl Jung discovered something that the spiritual marketplace desperately wants to keep hidden. Most people trying to vibrate higher are actually doing the opposite. They're using spiritual concepts to avoid the one thing that actually creates transformation, and that avoidance is keeping them stuck in the exact frequency they're trying to escape. Jung spent decades studying people who claimed to be spiritually awakened, who talked about high vibrations and consciousness elevation. And what he found was disturbing. The spiritual practices most people were using weren't raising their frequency. They were creating sophisticated defense mechanisms that allowed them to avoid psychological reality while feeling enlightened. They were vibrating at the same low frequency as before, just with better vocabulary and more expensive meditation cushions. What Jung discovered was radical, real elevation of consciousness, what people call vibrating higher, doesn't come from adding spiritual practices to your life. It comes from subtracting the psychological patterns that keep you operating from fear, wound, and unconsciousness. And there are 5 specific things Jung identified that you must give up completely if you want to genuinely transform, not modify, not manage, give up entirely. Today I'm going to show you the 5 things Jung said you must release to actually vibrate higher, why each one is harder to surrender than you think, how holding on to them keeps you trapped in low-frequency consciousness, and what becomes possible when you finally let them go. Jung's framework for what he called individuation, becoming whole unto yourself, was built on a simple principle that most spiritual seekers completely miss. You don't elevate consciousness by adding things. You elevate it by removing the blocks that prevent your natural state from emerging. Your true frequency, what people call your highest vibration, is already there. It's been buried under layers of psychological defense, societal conditioning, and traumatic adaptation. And those layers don't dissolve through positive thinking. They dissolve through radical release. He observed thousands of patients who came to him seeking transformation. They wanted to be more conscious, more awakened, more evolved. And Jung would ask them a question that most found disturbing. What are you willing to give up to get there? Because everyone wanted the elevated state, but almost no one wanted to surrender what maintaining that elevated state would cost them. They wanted transformation that let them keep their comfortable identities, their familiar relationships, their habitual ways of being, and Jung knew that was impossible. Real transformation, genuine elevation of your frequency, requires you to die to who you've been, not metaphorically, psychologically. Patterns that have defined you must end. Identities you've worn must be shed. Relationships built on your old frequency must transform or dissolve. And most people, when they truly understand what vibrating higher actually costs, choose to stay where they are. They keep doing the spiritual practices that make them feel like they're growing while protecting them from actual change. The first thing you must give up to vibrate higher is the need to be seen as good. Jung called this the persona, the mask of acceptability you've built to gain approval and avoid rejection. And he was emphatic that you cannot vibrate at a high frequency while maintaining a persona designed to make others comfortable with you. Think about how much energy you spend managing other people's perceptions of you, proving you're kind, compassionate, evolved, spiritual, performing goodness so consistently that you've forgotten what you actually feel underneath the performance. You silence your anger because spiritual people don't get angry. You override your boundaries because conscious people are understanding and forgiving. You exhaust yourself being available and helpful because that's what good people do. Jung discovered that this performance of goodness is one of the lowest frequency states a human can operate from, because it's entirely fear-based. You're not being good because goodness naturally flows through you. You're performing good to avoid the terror of being seen as bad, rejected, or unlovable. And that fear, that constant vigilance about whether you're appearing acceptable, keeps you vibrating at the frequency of survival, not sovereignty. What Jung observed in people who actually elevated their consciousness was that they stopped performing goodness and started being authentic. And authentic meant they could be kind and they could be fierce. They could be generous and they could say no. They could be compassionate and they could call out bullshit. They accessed their full range of human response instead of limiting themselves to the narrow band society calls good. This terrified the people around them because humans who've released the good persona are unpredictable. You can't manipulate them with guilt because they're not trying to prove they're good anymore. You can't shame them into compliance because they've accepted that some people will think they're bad and they're okay with that. They've given up the need to be seen as good, and that surrender freed them to operate from actual integrity instead of performed virtue. But here's what makes this so hard to release. Your identity as a good person has probably been your primary survival strategy since childhood. Maybe you learned early that being good kept you safe, that performing kindness prevented punishment or abandonment, that maintaining the acceptable persona was how you earned love that should have been unconditional. So, releasing the need to be seen as good feels like psychological death. Because it is. The self you've built around goodness has to die for your authentic self to emerge. Jung would tell you that you'll know you've released this need when you can disappoint people without collapsing into shame, when you can be misunderstood without desperately trying to correct the misunderstanding, when you can be called selfish or unkind and feel stable in knowing your own truth regardless of others' perceptions. That stability, that internal knowing that doesn't require external validation, is what operating at a higher frequency actually feels like. The second thing you must give up is the belief that you can help everyone. Jung studied what he called the wounded healer archetype, people compulsively driven to heal, help, and save others. And what he discovered was that this compulsion almost always came from unhealed wounds, not from genuine compassion. And it operated at one of the lowest frequencies Jung identified because it was fundamentally about the helper's ego needs, not the other person's well-being. You've probably been told that your empathy and desire to help others is a gift, that your sensitivity to others' pain is evidence of your spiritual advancement. But Jung would challenge you to look deeper. Is your helping actually serving others, or is it serving your need to feel valuable, needed, indispensable? Are you helping people who want help, or are you imposing help on people who haven't asked because you need to be the helper? Jung observed that wounded healers were addicted to being needed. Their entire sense of worth was built on other people requiring them. So, unconsciously, they surrounded themselves with people who would never fully heal, because if those people became whole, the healer would lose their purpose. The helping wasn't about the other person's liberation. It was about maintaining the helper's identity and avoiding their own healing work. This pattern operates at a low frequency because it's based in lack. You help because you don't feel valuable without being needed. You heal because you don't know who you are if you're not the healer. You save because if everyone's okay, you'll have to face your own unresolved pain. So you stay busy fixing everyone else, vibrating at the frequency of compulsion and avoidance, while calling it compassion and service. What Jung found in people who genuinely vibrated higher was that they released the compulsive need to help. They could offer support when asked and appropriate, but they weren't driven to fix, save, or heal everyone they encountered. They recognized that everyone's on their own journey, that sometimes people need to struggle to grow, and that imposing help is often violence disguised as kindness. Releasing this doesn't mean becoming cold or uncaring. It means recognizing the difference between genuine service and ego-driven rescuing. It means accepting that you're not responsible for everyone's well-being, that your worth isn't determined by how many people you help, that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is let someone face their own consequences and learn their own lessons. The hard part is that releasing the helper identity feels like losing your purpose. If you're not the person everyone comes to, who are you? If you're not needed, do you matter? These questions are terrifying because they reveal that your entire sense of self has been built on a low-frequency foundation. And dismantling that foundation to discover who you are without the helper role is painful, disorienting work. Jung would tell you that you've released this need when you can witness someone struggling and not feel compelled to intervene. When you can say, "That sounds really hard," without following it with solutions or offers to fix it. When you can let people have their own experiences without making those experiences about you and what you can do. That detachment, that ability to care without needing to control, is the frequency of genuine compassion instead of compulsive helping. Before we continue, check out our new guide, True Self-Discovery, with 24 practical reflection exercises inspired by the teachings of Carl Jung, designed to help you find your way within. Click below to get True Self-Discovery. The third thing you must give up to vibrate higher is attachment to being understood. Jung called this one of the most subtle but destructive patterns he observed. People spending enormous energy trying to make others understand them, explaining their choices, defending their boundaries, justifying their feelings. And that constant need for others to get you keeps you vibrating at the frequency of external validation instead of internal sovereignty. Think about how much time and energy you spend trying to make people understand why you did something, why you feel a certain way, why you made a particular choice. You have conversations where you explain yourself for 30 minutes, trying to articulate your experience in ways the other person will accept. And when they still don't get it, you feel frustrated, dismissed, or invisible. So you try again with different words, hoping this time they'll finally understand. Jung observed that this pattern revealed a fundamental lack of self-trust. If you need others to understand you to feel valid, you haven't yet developed the internal authority that makes high-frequency consciousness possible. You're still outsourcing your sense of reality to others' ability to comprehend it. And that outsourcing keeps you dependent on external validation, which is one of the lowest frequencies a conscious being can operate from. What Jung found in people who vibrated at genuinely high frequencies was that they'd released the need to be understood. They could share their experience if someone was genuinely interested and capable of receiving it, but they didn't need that person to understand to feel solid in their own truth. They knew what they knew. They felt what they felt. And whether anyone else comprehended that or not didn't change the validity of their experience. This is radically different from how most people operate. Most people need consensus reality. If others don't see what you see, you start questioning whether you're seeing clearly. If others don't feel what you feel, you wonder if your feelings are wrong. You need others to validate your perception because you don't trust your own perception yet. And that lack of self-trust is what keeps you seeking understanding from people who often aren't capable of providing it. Releasing attachment to being understood means accepting that most people won't get you. They can't, they're not in your consciousness, they haven't lived your experiences, they don't perceive reality the way you do. And that's okay. You don't need them to understand. You need you to understand. Your relationship with your own truth needs to be strong enough that it doesn't require anyone else's comprehension to remain solid. Jung warned that releasing this attachment would isolate you, because once you stop explaining yourself, once you stop trying to make others understand, many relationships that were built on your need for validation will dissolve. People will accuse you of being closed off or not caring about connection. But what's actually happening is that you're releasing relationships based on you performing and explaining yourself. And you're creating space for relationships where you can just be. You'll know you've released this need when someone fundamentally misunderstands you and you feel okay. When you can have a conversation where you're completely unseen and walk away without the compulsion to try again. When you can make choices that don't make sense to anyone else and feel stable in your knowing regardless of others' confusion. That internal stability, that self-trust that doesn't require external comprehension, is what vibrating higher actually feels like. The fourth thing you must give up is the fantasy of who people could become. Jung called this projection, seeing potential in people and relating to that potential instead of who they actually are right now. And he found this was one of the most common patterns keeping people stuck at low frequencies because it prevented them from seeing and responding to reality. You meet someone and you see their potential, what they could be if they healed their trauma, released their patterns, did their inner work, and you relate to that potential person instead of the actual person in front of you. You stay in relationships with people who consistently hurt you because you can see who they'd be if they changed. You give endless chances to people who show you exactly who they are because you're convinced they could become someone different. Jung observed that this pattern was fundamentally about the perceiver, not the person being projected onto. You're not seeing their potential, you're projecting your own need for them to be different onto them. Maybe you need them to be safe so you can stop feeling afraid. Maybe you need them to be capable so you don't have to face your own situation. Maybe you need them to change so you don't have to make the hard choice to leave. Whatever the need, it's yours. And you're using the fantasy of their potential to avoid dealing with the reality of who they are. This operates at a low frequency because it's based in denial. You're refusing to see what's actually in front of you. You're creating an elaborate story about future possibilities to avoid responding to present reality. And that denial, that inability to see and accept what is, keeps you stuck in patterns that never serve you because you're relating to fantasies instead of truth. What Jung found in people who genuinely elevated their consciousness was that they released projection. They saw people clearly, exactly as they were, not as they could be. And they made decisions based on current reality, not future potential. This didn't make them pessimistic or lacking in compassion. It made them realistic. They could have hope that people might change while accepting they probably won't. And they didn't stay in situations hoping for transformation that never came. Releasing this fantasy is devastating because it means accepting that people you love might never become who you need them to be. The parent who you've been hoping would finally see you probably never will. The partner who you're convinced could be amazing if they just did the work probably won't do it. The friend who keeps hurting you isn't going to suddenly become who you need them to be. They are who they are. And you've been relating to a fantasy version that doesn't exist. Jung emphasized that this release required grief. You have to mourn the person you thought they could become. You have to let that fantasy die so you can finally see the actual human in front of you and decide if that actual human is someone you want in your life, not their potential, them, as they are, right now. You'll know you've released this fantasy when you can see someone's patterns without immediately thinking about how those patterns could change. When you can witness someone showing you exactly who they are and believe them instead of overlaying potential onto them. When you can make choices about relationships based on current reality instead of future possibilities. That clarity, that ability to see what actually is instead of what could be, is essential for vibrating at a frequency based in truth instead of denial. The fifth thing you must give up to vibrate higher is the identity of being wounded. Jung called this one of the most confronting releases because people have often built their entire sense of self around their trauma and wounds. And releasing that identity feels like losing yourself, because it is. The self you've built around being wounded has to die for your healed self to emerge. You've probably heard that healing is about acknowledging your wounds, understanding how they shaped you, feeling the pain you've carried, and all of that is true and necessary. But Jung discovered that many people never move beyond this acknowledgement stage. They understand their wounds. They can articulate exactly how they were hurt and what those experiences did to them, but they stay identified with being wounded. They introduce themselves through their trauma. They relate to others through shared pain. Their entire personality is organized around the fact that they were hurt. Jung observed that this identification with woundedness keeps people vibrating at the frequency of victim consciousness. Not victim in a judgmental sense. Victim as in someone whose entire orientation is determined by what was done to them. Their choices, their relationships, their way of being in the world, all filtered through their wound identity. And that filter keeps them operating from the low frequency of unhealed trauma even when they've done years of healing work. What Jung found was that genuine elevation of consciousness required people to release their identity as wounded. This didn't mean denying that harm happened. It meant no longer organizing their entire existence around that harm. It meant integrating the experiences without being defined by them. It meant becoming someone who had those experiences, but isn't those experiences. This is one of the hardest things Jung asked people to release because being wounded often comes with secondary gains. People are more patient with you. Your struggles make sense. You have an explanation for why life is hard. You belong to communities of other wounded people. Releasing the wounded identity means giving up those benefits and standing as someone who's responsible for their life now, regardless of what happened before. Jung warned that many people resist this release because unconsciously, they're more invested in being right about their woundedness than in actually healing. They want validation that they were hurt, that it wasn't their fault, that their struggles make sense, and they'll stay wounded forever to keep receiving that validation rather than moving into the uncomfortable territory of being responsible for who they become, despite what happened to them. Releasing the wounded identity doesn't mean the trauma never happened, or that it didn't affect you. It means you're no longer leading with it. You're no longer introducing yourself as your wounds. You're no longer relating to the world through the lens of what was done to you. You've integrated the experiences and become someone larger than them, someone who carries scars but isn't defined by them. You'll know you've released this identity when you can talk about your past without it being the most interesting thing about you. When your trauma history isn't your introduction to new people. When you can connect with others without bonding through shared woundedness. When you're more interested in who you're becoming than in explaining why you are the way you are because of what happened. That orientation toward possibility instead of past is what operating at a higher frequency feels like. Here's what Jung ultimately discovered about these 5 releases. Most people never make them because each one requires a death, not a metaphorical death, an actual psychological death of an identity you've been wearing, a pattern you've been running, a way of being you've been maintaining. And humans avoid death, even psychological death, with everything they have. So they stay vibrating at low frequencies while doing spiritual practices that make them feel like they're growing. They meditate but keep performing goodness to gain approval. They do healing work but stay compulsively helping others. They read spiritual books but keep trying to make everyone understand them. They go to therapy but hold on to the fantasy of who people could become. They do inner child work but never release their identity as wounded. And none of it creates genuine transformation because they're adding practices to their life without subtracting the patterns that keep them stuck. They're trying to vibrate higher while clinging to the very things that keep them operating at low frequencies. And Jung would tell you, that won't work, ever. You cannot vibrate higher while maintaining the patterns that belong to lower frequencies. Something has to die. 5 somethings, actually. If you're genuinely committed to elevating your consciousness to what people call vibrating higher, Jung's framework gives you the map. Give up the need to be seen as good and become authentic. Give up the compulsion to help everyone and develop discernment. Give up attachment to being understood and cultivate self-trust. Give up the fantasy of who people could be and see reality clearly. Give up your identity as wounded and integrate your experiences without being defined by them. Each release will feel like dying because parts of you that have existed for years, maybe decades, will have to end. The self you've known will dissolve. And there's a terrifying period where the old you is gone, but the new you hasn't fully emerged yet. Jung called this the void. And it's in that void, that space between death and rebirth, that actual transformation happens. But here's what becomes possible when you make these releases. You operate from authenticity instead of performance. You serve from genuine compassion instead of ego need. You trust your own knowing instead of seeking validation. You see reality clearly instead of relating to fantasies. You stand as someone responsible for who you're becoming instead of someone defined by what happened to you. And that stance, that orientation, is what vibrating at a genuinely high frequency actually means. It's not about crystals and sage and positive affirmations. It's not about meditation apps and manifestation rituals. Those things might support the process, but they're not the process. The process is release, death, surrender, giving up the patterns, identities, and ways of being that keep you trapped in low-frequency consciousness even when you're doing all the spiritual practices. Jung's message was simple but brutal. You want to vibrate higher? Stop trying to add things and start releasing what's keeping you low. These 5 releases, performed goodness, compulsive helping, need for understanding, fantasy projection, wounded identity. These are the weights keeping you trapped. Cut them loose. Watch them die. Grieve who you were when you carried them. And discover who you actually are when you're no longer weighed down by patterns that never served your highest self. That's what vibrating higher actually means. Not feeling peaceful and enlightened while maintaining all your low-frequency patterns, but becoming someone fundamentally different through the courage to release what no longer serves. Someone who's died to who they were and emerged as who they actually are. That transformation, that genuine elevation of consciousness is possible, but only if you're willing to give up these 5 things completely. Not manage them, not modify them, give them up, let them die, and discover what emerges on the other side of that death. That's Jung's framework. That's the real path to vibrating higher. And it costs everything you've been clinging to while promising you freedom you've never known. If you haven't yet, check out our new guide, True Self-Discovery, with 24 practical reflection exercises inspired by the teachings of Carl Jung, designed to help you find your way within. Click below to get True Self-Discovery.